The funeral flowers were still fresh on my father's grave when the process server handed me papers that would change my life forever. Standing there in my black suit, still tasting the bitter coffee from the church reception, I stared at a lawsuit demanding $300,000 for egregious property violations on land my family had owned since before Elvis was famous. But here's what Margaret Thornfield and her precious HOA board didn't know. They weren't just messing with a grieving son. They were about to discover that attacking the wrong family at the wrong time can turn your entire world upside down in ways you never imagined possible. What would you do if power-hungry neighbors tried to steal your family legacy while you were burying your father? Drop your wildest revenge story in the comments. And let me know where you're watching from. I read every single comment. Let me paint you the picture of how we got to this nuclear meltdown. Because understanding the players in this game is crucial to appreciating just how spectacularly Margaret was about to faceplant into legal quicksand. My name is Daniel Martinez, and I'm 39 years old, a third-generation electrician who inherited my father's electrical contracting business along with every stubborn principle and calloused hand that built our reputation. The property at the center of this war zone is a 2.8-acre slice of paradise that my grandfather Roberto purchased in 1948 for $650 cash, money he'd saved working double shifts at the steel mill. Picture this. Back in 1948, our land was surrounded by nothing but wheat fields stretching to the horizon. The modest 1,100-square-foot ranch house has weathered 7 decades of Illinois winters, but it's solid as a fortress. What really matters, though, is the large electrical workshop, where the steady hum of voltage testers mingles with the smell of copper wire, carrying on traditions that stretch back 3 generations. After my messy divorce last year, my 14-year-old son Miguel visits every other weekend. Watching him learn to strip wire and read circuit diagrams in the same workshop where his great-grandfather taught my father, and my father taught me, well, that's what you fight for when bureaucrats come knocking. Now let me introduce you to Margaret Thornfield, the 42-year-old former insurance adjuster who transformed herself into a neighborhood watchdog after moving into Meadowbrook Commons development 6 years ago. Margaret stands about 5'4" in her sensible flats with severely styled brown hair and the kind of permanent scowl that suggests she's disappointed in everyone around her. She carries herself with the righteous authority of someone who's never been wrong about anything in her entire life. Margaret lives in a 3,800-square-foot Tudor revival, complete with professionally landscaped gardens and a 3-car garage that houses vehicles she washes every Sunday with military precision. She became HOA president through a combination of relentless persistence, detailed Robert's Rules knowledge, and what can only be described as the ability to out-argue anyone into submission. Here's how the neighborhood changed around us over the decades. My family's property predates everything by 55 years. Until 2005, we were still surrounded by working farms. Then Greenfield Development Corporation purchased 180 acres and constructed a 52-house subdivision that literally wrapped around our existing property like a donut. The developer offered my father $320,000 to sell out. Serious money back then. But Dad refused, bless his stubborn Mexican heart, and when he passed last month, the land came to me along with everything that came with it. The worn leather of Grandpa's wire strippers, still sharp after 75 years, reminds me daily that some things are worth preserving no matter what others think. Margaret's campaign against my electrical business started with bureaucratic precision. Noise complaints filed for 7:30 a.m. work starts, even though city ordinance permits construction at 7 a.m. sharp. She demanded I relocate equipment behind visual barriers to maintain community aesthetics. She petitioned the city about commercial vehicle traffic disrupting their family-friendly atmosphere, code language I understood but initially chose to ignore. The harassment escalated methodically. Margaret dispatched city inspectors to examine my property 4 times in 6 weeks, desperately hunting for violations that didn't exist. Every permit was current, every installation was code compliant, every piece of equipment was properly stored. But Margaret wasn't finished building her case. The nuclear option arrived in the form of that $300,000 lawsuit for unauthorized commercial structures and zoning violations. The timing couldn't have been more calculated, served while I was still processing the reality that the man who taught me everything about integrity and hard work was gone forever. Margaret's opening salvo came in a legal envelope thick enough to stop a bullet. The complaint claimed my electrical workshop violated HOA covenants that somehow magically applied to land that existed decades before her precious subdivision was even a developer's pipe dream. She demanded immediate cessation of all commercial activities and removal of what she termed non-conforming structures, including my grandfather's original 1948 workshop built when permits were something you got for fishing, not fixing electrical panels. The threat was crystal clear: $500 daily penalties plus attorney fees with immediate compliance required. I could practically hear Margaret's satisfied exhale from across the street as she probably celebrated her brilliant legal strategy with a glass of organic wine and a spreadsheet of my estimated financial destruction. But here's the thing about electrical work. It teaches you to trace problems back to their source. While Margaret was probably planning my professional funeral, I was doing something revolutionary, actual detective work. Buried in my father's obsessively organized filing system, the man kept receipts from Carter administration. I discovered our original property deed from 1948. Not a photocopy, but the original document complete with my grandfather's careful signature and the county recorder's official seal. My electrician buddy Carlos had warned me about this exact scenario when his neighbor tried similar power plays. HOA covenants only apply to properties that actually agreed to be governed by them. My grandfather never signed any HOA agreement because there was no HOA to sign with when he bought this land. Our property deed predates Margaret's subdivision by 57 years. The lingering scent of my father's Brill cream still hung in his home office, and I swear I could feel his approval as I realized Margaret had just made her first catastrophic legal miscalculation. But Margaret wasn't content with private legal warfare. She organized what she called a community safety forum about my allegedly hazardous electrical operations. Picture 35 concerned residents packed into the Meadowbrook clubhouse watching Margaret's PowerPoint presentation titled Protecting Property Values and Family Safety. She created a Facebook group called Meadowbrook Safety Watch and posted photos of my work trucks with inflammatory captions like Industrial Hazard Threatens Children and Residential Zoning Under Attack. Her recruitment strategy was masterful, I'll admit. She assembled quite the coalition of concerned citizens. Dr. Patricia Vance, a pediatrician worried about electromagnetic field exposure from my equipment. Jennifer Walsh, a high school teacher concerned about dangerous electrical hazards near the school bus stop. Robert Chen, a financial advisor who spoke ominously about how commercial operations destroy residential property values. Margaret claimed my business attracted undesirable elements to their family-oriented community, and we all know exactly what that particular dog whistle means in suburban America. My counterintelligence operation was simple. Show up to their next HOA meeting with documentation, my surveyor buddy Carlos, and absolute confidence in the law. I walked into that clubhouse unannounced, spread our deed and survey documents across their conference table, and calmly explained the legal reality they were facing. Margaret's response was predictably condescending. She dismissed our evidence with a wave of her manicured hand and claimed my grandfather had somehow circumvented proper development protocols. The board, clearly coached beforehand, voted 5-0 to proceed with enforcement action against non-compliant properties. That's when I fired my first warning shot across their bow. Margaret, you might want to double-check your legal authority before this gets expensive for everyone involved. Here's where things started getting interesting. While Margaret thought she was intimidating me with legal theater, I was quietly documenting every harassment incident, photographing every frivolous inspection, building an evidence file that would make a federal prosecutor weep tears of joy. The rough concrete floor of my grandfather's workshop had witnessed 3 generations of honest electrical work, and it was about to witness the beginning of Margaret's spectacular legal implosion. Her response to my warning was to escalate in true HOA president fashion. She hired Brennan, Walsh, and Associates, a downtown firm with $20,000 retainers and billable hours more expensive than my truck payment, to send me a formal demand for property assessment and potential forced relocation. She actually claimed the HOA possessed community development authority to regulate pre-existing businesses, which told me everything I needed to know about her complete ignorance of property law. That's when the light bulb moment hit me like 220 volts. Margaret wasn't just trying to bully me into compliance, she was attempting to steal my family's land through legal intimidation, betting I couldn't afford to fight back against her suburban lawyer army. What Margaret didn't realize was that while she was playing tic-tac-toe, I was about to introduce her to 3-dimensional chess, and I'd been learning the rules for 39 years. Margaret's legal pressure campaign shifted into overdrive like a turbocharged engine driven by someone who'd never learned when to brake. Her attorneys started sending certified letters twice weekly, each one more ridiculous than its predecessor. They demanded environmental impact studies, traffic pattern analyses, and compliance reports that would have impressed the Department of Transportation. Margaret claimed my electrical supply storage violated hazardous materials regulations, conveniently ignoring that my properly ventilated storage shed met every OSHA standard and was inspected annually by certified safety engineers. She filed complaints with the county planning department, organized petition drives, and somehow convinced 41 residents to sign a document demanding my immediate business relocation. The irony was beautiful. These people wanted to relocate someone who'd been there since before most of them were born. My defensive strategy was textbook property rights warfare. I hired the best real estate attorney my savings could handle, Patricia Valdez came highly recommended by Carlos's sister, who'd used her to demolish a similar HOA power grab in the neighboring township. Patricia specialized in exactly this type of property dispute, and her first piece of advice was pure strategic gold. Document everything, assume nothing, and never let them see fear in your eyes. I installed high-definition security cameras around my property perimeter, created detailed timelines of every harassment incident, and filed counter-complaints for harassment and defamation with the county attorney's office. I also remembered something my father taught me about dealing with workplace bullies. Sometimes the best defense is letting them punch themselves unconscious. Margaret's next brilliant discovery was that my workshop's storage edition from 1997 lacked what she called proper modern permits. Technically, she had a point. My father had expanded the building before current permitting requirements existed, relying on grandfather clauses that protected existing structures. But Margaret treated this discovery like she'd found the Holy Grail, practically dancing to the next HOA meeting to announce her victory. The city building inspector, a reasonable guy named Steve who'd worked with both my father and grandfather, issued a violation notice because regulations required it. The fine was $25,000 plus mandatory structural modifications. Painful money that would hurt, but not destroy my business. Margaret celebrated prematurely at the following HOA meeting, already calculating the legal fees she thought she'd collect from my inevitable surrender. What Margaret didn't know was that I'd been conducting my own after-hours research project. Every evening after finishing electrical jobs, I'd been camping out at the county recorder's office, digging through basement archives that smelled like old newspapers and forgotten bureaucracy. Those humming fluorescent lights provided illumination while I photocopied documents dating back to the 1940s, and that's where I found the first hairline crack in Margaret's perfect suburban fortress. The original subdivision plat maps revealed a story that would make any property owner's blood run cold. When Greenfield Development Corporation surveyed Meadowbrook Commons in 2005, their surveyor made what my contractor friend Pete would call a career-ending whoopsie. They'd incorporated 0.4 acres of my family's land into their development plan. Land they didn't own, couldn't legally sell, and had absolutely no right to develop. But wait, it gets so much better. Several houses in Margaret's pristine neighborhood were constructed partially on my property. The foundation of 1423 Oak Street crossed my boundary line by 6 feet. The detached garage at 14027 Oak extended 15 feet onto my land. And the crown jewel of irony, the HOA's Community Recreation Center sat entirely on property my grandfather had been paying taxes on for 57 years. My evening research sessions uncovered something even more devastating. Buried in a dusty filing cabinet labeled Water Rights 1945-1955, I discovered a 1949 agreement granting my grandfather exclusive rights to the artesian well that supplied water to the entire area. Every drop flowing through Margaret's irrigation systems, every gallon filling those decorative water features, every sprinkler keeping those perfect lawns green during summer droughts. All of it came from my well, and Margaret had been violating my water rights for 6 years without even knowing it. The delicious irony was intoxicating. While she was scheming to fine me into bankruptcy, she'd been stealing my water to maintain her suburban paradise fantasy. I kept these discoveries secret, following Patricia's advice about not revealing your winning hand too early in the game. Instead, I quietly commissioned a professional surveying team to remap my entire property using GPS coordinates and laser precision equipment. The results confirmed what those dusty county records had suggested. 14 houses encroached on my land, the HOA common areas were technically my private property, and Margaret's own backyard pergola crossed the property line by 11 feet. But here's the twist that would change everything. While Margaret thought she was closing in for the kill with her permit violation discovery, I was sitting on information that could literally force half the neighborhood to relocate their homes at costs reaching $400,000 per family. But I wasn't ready to deploy that nuclear option yet. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is letting your enemy think they're winning right up until the moment they realize they've been digging their own legal grave with a golden shovel. Margaret had no idea she was about to receive a very expensive education about the difference between property law and wishful thinking. Margaret's escalation to federal agencies was like watching someone call in a missile strike on their own coordinates. She reported me to every regulatory body with alphabet soup names, claiming I was operating an illegal industrial facility in residential zoning and creating safety hazards that endangered the entire community. Environmental Protection Agency, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Federal Communications Commission for Electromagnetic Interference, even the Department of Transportation for commercial vehicle violations. Margaret wanted every bureaucrat in America to rain regulatory hellfire on my small electrical business. The inspection parade that followed was something straight out of a Kafka novel. 6 different agencies descended on my property within 10 days, clipboards armed and ready, searching for violations that existed only in Margaret's paranoid imagination. The OSHA inspector found my equipment properly stored and my workshop exceeding safety standards. The EPA discovered no contamination, no improper disposal methods, nothing. The FCC confirmed my equipment generated zero interference with residential electronics. The transportation inspector verified my commercial vehicle licensing was current and compliant. Margaret's response to these clean bills of regulatory health? She accused every single inspector of corruption and demanded investigations from their respective state-level supervisors. Watching her meltdown during the city council meeting was like witnessing the final boss battle of suburban Karens, all the classic moves deployed with increasing desperation and decreasing effectiveness. Meanwhile, my attorney Patricia was educating me about something called adverse possession that made my blood run cold with possibility. She explained it in terms that would haunt any property owner. If someone encroaches on your land for 20 years without your legal objection, they can claim ownership of that encroached property through court action. The clock had started ticking when Greenfield Development built those first houses in 2005, and we were approaching the danger zone where silence could cost me everything. The texture of those worn leather law books in Patricia's office felt smooth as silk between my fingers as she showed me case after case of property owners who'd lost ancestral land through legal ignorance and bureaucratic apathy. I had a narrow window to reclaim what was rightfully mine, but timing and strategy would be everything. Margaret's media campaign was her next masterstroke of public relations stupidity. She contacted Channel 12 News about commercial operator, threatens residential safety, arranging an interview with investigative reporter Amanda Rodriguez. Margaret portrayed herself as the courageous community leader defending property values and child safety from my allegedly dangerous electrical operation. She'd prepared talking points, printed handouts, even created a timeline of my escalating violations that read like fiction, written by someone who'd never met reality. The beautiful thing about truth is its annoying habit of surfacing when liars least expect it. When Amanda Rodriguez arrived with her camera crew, I was ready with something Margaret apparently forgot existed: facts. I didn't raise my voice, didn't display anger, didn't provide the unhinged business owner footage they might have expected. Instead, I calmly presented documentation. My permits, my grandfather's original deed, my family's timeline of legal ownership, and Patricia's legal analysis of the situation. Amanda was a real journalist, not just another ratings-chasing talking head looking for easy conflict. She recognized the difference between legitimate news and manufactured neighborhood drama. The segment that aired wasn't zoning violation threatens subdivision. It was HOA overreach, when property rights collide with suburban control. Margaret's fury at the biased reporting was spectacular to witness. She called the station demanding retractions and threatening lawsuits for defamatory coverage. But here's where her escalation strategy truly backfired with nuclear force. I'd filed a Freedom of Information Act request for HOA financial records, and what I discovered in those manila folders made Margaret's media tantrum look like amateur hour at the anger management clinic. The HOA had spent $52,000 on legal fees fighting me, money extracted from mandatory assessments charged to every homeowner in the subdivision. Margaret had been funding her personal vendetta with her neighbors' money, and most of them had no idea where their quarterly payments were disappearing. The scent of old paper and betrayed trust filled the air as I documented expense after expense that benefited nobody except Margaret's ego and her attorney's retirement fund. Several neighbors began asking uncomfortable questions about unauthorized spending increases. Why had assessment fees doubled without explanation? Where was the promised money for street repairs and landscape improvements? The answers were buried in Brennan, Walsh & Associates billing statements. Hundreds of attorney hours billed for researching creative ways to destroy a neighbor whose only crime was existing before their subdivision. But the real nuclear bombshell came when I discovered something that would make Margaret's entire legal position collapse like a controlled demolition. Hidden in the HOA's incorporation documents was a residency requirement that the president must live in the community for at least 8 years before taking office. Margaret had only lived in Meadowbrook Commons for 6 years when elected. Her entire presidency was technically invalid according to the HOA's own bylaws. Every vote she'd cast, every decision she'd authorized, every legal action she'd initiated, all of it was null and void under their own governing documents. Margaret had been playing dictator in a game where she wasn't even qualified to hold the dice. The woman who thought she could steal my family's legacy through legal intimidation was about to discover that bureaucracy is a double-edged sword, and she'd been holding it by the sharp end this entire time. The comprehensive title search that would detonate Margaret's world cost me $1,200 and 4 weeks of bureaucratic patience, but it delivered information worth more than her entire mortgage balance. When that thick envelope arrived from Heritage Title Research, I knew I was holding either my financial salvation or the deed to my family's destruction. What I found inside was better than winning the lottery and worse than Margaret's most paranoid nightmares combined into one legal document. The exhaustive title search reaching back to the 1920s revealed a detail that made my electrician's brain practically short-circuit with possibility. Greenfield Development Corporation had never obtained proper legal easements for road access to the entire subdivision. Every single homeowner in Meadowbrook Commons accessed their property by driving across land that legally belonged to me. Let me break this down in terms that would make any homeowner wake up in cold sweats. Those picturesque tree-lined streets winding through Margaret's suburban wonderland. My property. The main entrance with its expensive brick columns and Meadowbrook Commons signage. My land. The entire road infrastructure connecting 52 homes to the outside world. All of it crossed my family's property without legal permission or compensation. The original 1948 boundary survey was more accurate than the 2005 subdivision survey, and the development surveyor had made a 15-foot measurement error on the eastern boundary line. That error compounded across the entire development like a geometric virus, affecting 38 of the 52 homes built in the community. My property included not just road access, but also the HOA clubhouse, the community pool complex, and that precious main entrance Margaret loved photographing for the neighborhood newsletter. Patricia nearly choked on her coffee when I spread those documents across her desk. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "you don't just have property rights violations here, you have the legal authority to shut down an entire neighborhood." The financial implications were staggering enough to require scientific notation. Property tax records showed I'd been paying taxes on land that others were occupying, developing, and using for profit. The county assessor agreed to review the situation immediately, which meant my neighbors faced reassessment and potentially massive tax increases once boundaries were officially corrected. Insurance companies would demand new surveys before renewing homeowner policies. Multiple mortgage companies had already been notified of the boundary disputes, and property values weren't just at risk. They were in mathematical freefall towards zero. Margaret's panic response was immediate and predictable as sunrise. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, suddenly interested in neighborly compromise after months of legal warfare and threats of financial annihilation. Gone was the imperious tone and demands for my complete surrender. In its place sat a desperate woman offering $85,000 for easement rights to land conservatively worth 10 times that amount. "This is obviously just an innocent surveying mistake by the previous developer," she pleaded, as if repeating it would make it legally true. "We can resolve this like reasonable neighbors without involving expensive litigation." But the water rights revelation was still waiting to detonate like a delayed nuclear device. My grandfather's 1949 agreement gave me exclusive control over the artesian well producing 45,000 gallons daily, water that Margaret's neighborhood consumed at a rate of 38,000 gallons per day for irrigation, decorative features, and that ridiculous retention pond. I could legally shut off their water supply tomorrow morning and watch 38 families scramble to explain brown lawns and empty swimming pools to their mortgage companies. The HOA faced a binary choice: pay me $180,000 to drill new wells and install independent water infrastructure, or negotiate fair compensation for 6 years of unauthorized water usage. Margaret had spent $52,000 trying to destroy my livelihood, but solving just the water rights issue would cost her community 4 times that amount. As I sat in my grandfather's workshop, surrounded by tools that had built honest electrical systems for 3 generations, the irony was absolutely beautiful. Margaret had attempted to bankrupt me with manufactured legal fees and imaginary violations. Instead, she'd handed me leverage that could force her entire neighborhood into financial catastrophe. I controlled property access, water rights, land usage, and the legal authority to demand compensation for decades of unpaid occupancy. Margaret's leadership credibility evaporated like morning mist in hell. Her supporters abandoned ship faster than rats from the Titanic, and the neighborhood unity she'd claimed to protect was fracturing along financial fault lines. The woman who delivered legal threats on my father's funeral day was about to learn that sometimes karma doesn't come alone. Sometimes it brings lawyers, accountants, and surveying equipment. Assembling the legal dream team that would systematically dismantle Margaret's suburban empire felt like recruiting the Avengers, if the Avengers specialized in property law and had personal grievances against HOA tyrants. Patricia Valdez remained my legal foundation, a property rights attorney who'd built her reputation, destroying developers and HOA bullies across 4 counties. She had this gift for explaining complex legal concepts in language that made perfect sense, like when she broke down easement law. Think of it as your neighbor using your driveway every single day for 6 years, then claiming they own it because you never explicitly told them to stop. Carlos Mendoza, my surveyor friend, became our technical precision specialist. This guy could read property maps like most people read grocery store circulars, and his GPS equipment was more accurate than military satellites. Carlos created boundary maps showing every single encroachment down to the precise inch. 14 houses, 1 clubhouse, 2 major roadways, and a recreation center, all sitting comfortably on my family's legally owned land. Maria Santos, my accountant, calculated numbers that would make Margaret's neighbors reach for antacid tablets and anxiety medication. She computed the HOA's potential financial exposure at $750,000, $180,000 for legal defense costs, $400,000 for new surveys and title insurance corrections, and $170,000 for water infrastructure installation. My total costs? A manageable $30,000 for surveys, legal fees, and documentation. Sometimes the most effective offense is making defense prohibitively expensive to sustain. Tommy Rodriguez, my contractor buddy who'd worked alongside my father for 18 years, helped document every improvement and modification I'd made to the property. We photographed structures, cataloged equipment installations, and created a comprehensive timeline showing decades of legitimate use, proper maintenance, and continuous occupation. Tommy's construction expertise would be crucial if this escalated to courtroom warfare. Nobody understands building codes and property development like someone who's been constructing and repairing for 3 decades. Dr. Lisa Chang, an environmental consultant Patricia recommended, analyzed my water rights with scientific precision that would impress university researchers. Her detailed report confirmed my artesian well produced 45,000 gallons daily, while the neighborhood consumed 38,000 gallons for irrigation, decorative water features, and pond maintenance. The legal mechanism was elegantly simple. Water licensing required my explicit permission for any commercial or community usage beyond basic residential needs. Patricia explained our legal strategy using terms that resonated with an electrician's systematic brain. A quiet title action will force the court to resolve all boundary disputes definitively and permanently. Every affected neighbor will need to hire attorneys and surveyors, with individual costs reaching $20,000 to $30,000 per household. The beauty of property disputes is they're financially devastating for everyone except the person who's actually legally correct. Maria's financial analysis revealed the nuclear option that could end this war immediately. I could demand fair market rent for 6 years of unauthorized land usage, plus damages for water theft, plus legal fees and court costs. We're talking about forcing settlement payments that could bankrupt families who'd simply wanted to live in suburban peace. But Dr. Chang's water rights documentation provided the most elegant leverage imaginable. Every gallon flowing through Margaret's irrigation systems, every drop filling that retention pond, every sprinkler keeping those lawns green during drought seasons, all of it originated from my well without permission or compensation. I could shut off their water tomorrow and watch 38 families scramble to explain dead landscaping to their homeowner insurance companies. The documentation process required military-level precision and attention to detail. Carlos surveyed every property encroachment with GPS accuracy. Dr. Chang measured water flow rates and documented 6 years of unauthorized consumption. Tommy photographed structures requiring relocation or demolition. Patricia filed preliminary quiet title paperwork that would legally notify every neighbor of impending boundary corrections. Our psychological warfare strategy was equally methodical. Patricia advised maintaining public reasonableness while allowing Margaret to make increasingly aggressive moves that would expose her true character to the community. Every time Margaret escalated with threats or public tantrums, I would respond with calm professionalism and documented facts. The contrast would be obvious to anyone paying attention to the actual evidence. I spent evenings identifying potential allies among HOA residents, focusing specifically on families facing unexpected special assessments to fund Margaret's legal crusade. Several neighbors had expressed private frustration about mandatory fee increases they correctly identified as funding a personal vendetta rather than community improvements. The steady rhythm of my copy machine producing legal documentation became the soundtrack of approaching justice. Media preparation was crucial for public perception management. Patricia coached me on interview techniques, emphasizing key messages about property rights, legal precedent, and reasonable conflict resolution. We practiced maintaining composure under hostile questioning, because Margaret's remaining allies would attempt to portray me as the unreasonable party disrupting neighborhood harmony. The goal was community opinion management. Let residents see who was actually trying to solve problems versus who was manufacturing them for personal gain. Everything was aligning like a perfectly wired electrical system. We possessed the legal foundation, technical expertise, financial analysis, and strategic patience necessary to let Margaret's increasingly desperate maneuvers expose her true motivations. Sometimes, the most effective way to defeat a bully is providing them sufficient rope to construct their own gallows. The woman who'd attempted to steal my family's legacy through legal intimidation was about to discover that thorough preparation defeats desperate improvisation every single time. Margaret's descent into complete desperation was a masterclass demonstration of how not to handle a deteriorating legal position. She called an emergency homeowner assembly demanding a special assessment of $750 per household to fund what she dramatically termed the battle for our community's survival. Standing behind that clubhouse podium in her Navy power suit, voice trembling with manufactured emotion, she painted me as some kind of property rights extremist holding their entire neighborhood hostage to my unreasonable demands. The community response was brutally swift and unforgiving. 31 families categorically refused to pay additional fees for what they accurately identified as Margaret's personal war against a neighbor who'd existed peacefully for decades. The Morrison family stood up and demanded explanations for why their quarterly fees had tripled without prior notification or community input. The Chen family called for an immediate financial audit of HOA spending. Even Dr. Vance, one of Margaret's original supporters, publicly questioned the wisdom of throwing community money after Margaret's personal legal battles. The HOA board hemorrhaged members faster than a punctured air mattress. 3 directors resigned within 8 days, citing concerns about fiscal irresponsibility and catastrophic leadership failures. The remaining board voted 2-1 to continue legal proceedings, but their enthusiasm was evaporating like water in August heat. That's when Margaret's husband crossed the line into criminal behavior. My high-definition security cameras, thank God I'd invested in professional-grade equipment, captured someone vandalizing my property at 3:23 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. The footage was crystal clear and legally admissible. Frank Thornfield, Margaret's husband, slashing my work truck tires with a utility knife, then spray painting "MOVE" across my workshop door in bright red letters. The man actually paused to look directly into the camera at one point, as if he wanted positive identification for his arrest warrant. The police report was filed by 7:30 a.m. Detective Maria Gonzalez, who'd attended high school with my father, shook her head while reviewing the security footage. "Daniel, I've investigated stupid crimes before, but this is PhD-level stupidity. Guys looking at criminal mischief, vandalism, possibly harassment charges, depending on the pattern." Margaret's response to her husband's arrest was to claim Frank had been investigating ongoing noise violations and possessed every right to protect community standards through citizen oversight. She actually stood in her driveway shouting at news reporters that local police were corrupt and obviously biased in my favor. Watching your enemy's public meltdown broadcast in high definition while news cameras captured every unhinged moment. That's therapeutic value you simply cannot purchase. I maintained measured responses throughout, filing restraining orders against Frank and upgrading security with motion-activated lighting that could illuminate a baseball stadium. Every harassment incident was carefully documented in Patricia's expanding case file, building toward a civil lawsuit that would make Margaret's current legal fees appear insignificant. But Margaret's most spectacular failure was yet to arrive like a freight train, loaded with consequences. City Councilwoman Sarah Thompson, a respected public servant who'd represented our district for 14 years, received an unexpected office visit from our neighborhood HOA president. Margaret arrived with a $15,000 campaign contribution check and a request that Thompson pressure the building department to condemn my property as a public safety hazard. Thompson did exactly what any honest politician should do. She reported the attempted bribery to the district attorney's office and personally escorted Margaret from City Hall. The local newspaper picked up the corruption story within hours, and suddenly Margaret's crusade against me became secondary to her attempted subversion of democratic governance. The financial pressure was mounting like steam in a pressure cooker without relief valves. The HOA bank account, once healthy with homeowner contributions, had dwindled to $12,000 after spending $67,000 on anti-Daniel legal campaigns and associated costs. The board treasurer, a mild-mannered retired teacher named Patricia Wilson, went public with complete spending records during a community meeting that devolved into absolute chaos reminiscent of a town hall meeting during the French Revolution. Homeowners learned their mandatory assessments had funded hundreds of attorney hours, private investigators, environmental consultants, surveying costs, and legal filing fees, all deployed to attack a neighbor whose only transgression was existing before their subdivision was constructed. Multiple families threatened individual lawsuits against board members for unauthorized spending that exceeded their fiduciary authority. The community management company, exhausted by constant drama and negative publicity, announced they wouldn't renew their service contract when it expired. Margaret's environmental complaint to the EPA was her final desperate Hail Mary pass thrown directly into a brick wall at maximum velocity. She filed an official report claiming my electrical equipment storage was contaminating groundwater supplies, despite possessing zero scientific evidence and no factual basis for the serious allegation. The EPA investigation consumed 8 weeks and cost taxpayers thousands of dollars in federal resources. The results were devastating to Margaret's remaining credibility, Not only did investigators find zero contamination, but Dr. Chang's water quality analysis proved my well water exceeded municipal purity standards by significant margins. EPA investigators were decidedly not amused by the knowingly false environmental report, and filing deliberately false federal environmental complaints constitutes a serious crime with substantial legal consequences, including potential prison time. The revelation that sealed Margaret's fate arrived through an anonymous tip that led Channel 12 News to investigate Margaret's professional background. Reporter Amanda Rodriguez discovered Margaret had been terminated from her insurance adjuster position 4 years earlier for falsifying damage reports and manipulating claim settlements. The woman, positioning herself as a community integrity crusader, possessed a documented professional history of deliberate dishonesty and fraud. HOA residents who'd trusted Margaret to protect their property investments learned their president was a proven liar who'd been systematically using their money to fund personal vendettas. The neighborhood petition demanding Margaret's immediate resignation collected 47 signatures in 3 days. Even her closest allies began distancing themselves from her sinking political ship. Meanwhile, Frank faced pending criminal charges for property vandalism. Margaret confronted potential federal prosecution for false EPA reporting, and their marriage was disintegrating under the combined pressure of legal bills, public humiliation, and mutual recriminations. The couple who'd attempted to destroy my family's electrical legacy were systematically destroying their own lives instead, one stupid decision at a time. Sometimes karma operates with perfect efficiency. It just requires patience and documentation. Margaret's final desperate gambit was hiring a private investigator to dig up compromising information about me, because apparently when legal intimidation, property vandalism, and attempted political bribery fail, the logical next step is professional stalking. She spent $4,500 of her own money, the HOA accounts were completely drained, on some discount PI who looked like he'd learned detective work from binge-watching Netflix crime shows. The guy possessed all the subtlety of a fire truck in a library. My neighbors started calling to report a suspicious character in a dented Toyota Camry taking photographs of my property, following my work truck to job sites, and asking bizarre questions about my business practices and personal life. Margaret's desperation had reached the point where she was literally paying someone to harass me while facing potential federal charges for her EPA fraud. But here's where Margaret's criminal mastermind really demonstrated her genius. She decided to manufacture evidence against me. At 4:12 a.m. on a Friday morning, my security cameras captured someone dumping construction debris on my property. Broken concrete blocks, rusted metal pipes, and paint cans that definitely hadn't originated from my electrical workshop. The perpetrator was careful to avoid direct lighting, but they made one crucial tactical error. They used Jennifer Walsh's distinctive Honda Pilot. Jennifer Walsh, you'll remember, was Margaret's teacher ally who'd supported her crusade from the beginning. Apparently, loyalty has expiration dates when your fearless leader starts requesting actual felony participation. The police arrested Jennifer within 4 hours, and her confession was faster than a microwave dinner. Margaret had convinced her this was community self-defense and promised to cover all legal expenses if complications arose. Spoiler alert, Margaret didn't cover anything. Margaret's digital smear campaign went nuclear with the creation of anonymous social media accounts specifically designed to destroy my electrical contracting business. Fake reviews materialized on Google, Yelp, and Better Business Bureau claiming I was dangerous, incompetent, and mentally unstable. She posted my business phone number on Craigslist with advertisements for free electrical work and emergency service calls, flooding my voicemail with confused homeowners seeking services I'd never offered. The psychological warfare extended directly to my customer base. Margaret somehow obtained my client contact list, probably through her PI's questionable methods, and started calling potential customers with warnings about hiring a contractor under federal criminal investigation. That last part contained a grain of truth since the EPA had investigated her false environmental report. But Margaret twisted the narrative to suggest I was the subject of criminal charges rather than the victim of her fraudulent complaints. I lost 3 potential contracts worth $22,000 because homeowners got spooked by Margaret's lies. But every attack she launched just provided more evidence for Patricia's defamation lawsuit, and by this point we possessed enough documented harassment to fund Miguel's entire college education through civil court settlements. My silent preparation during this chaos resembled a master chess player positioning pieces for an inevitable checkmate. Patricia filed comprehensive defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and conspiracy lawsuits against both Margaret and her remaining allies. We subpoenaed Margaret's phone records, internet browsing history, and financial statements. Her systematic harassment campaign was about to become very expensive evidence in multiple courtrooms. The insurance revelation that nobody anticipated hit the neighborhood like a financial earthquake measuring 8.0 on the bankruptcy scale. Homeowner insurance companies, alerted to boundary disputes by nervous title companies, began reviewing policies for properties with potential ownership complications. Several major insurers threatened immediate policy cancellations until boundary disputes were resolved through proper legal channels and official court determinations. Property values, which Margaret had claimed to be protecting through her vigilant leadership, officially collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Real estate agents started warning potential buyers about Meadowbrook Commons using phrases that sounded like warnings about toxic waste sites, ongoing litigation, boundary disputes, title defects, and unresolved property rights issues. The exact problem Margaret claimed to be preventing, declining property values, became harsh reality because of her actions and decisions. The neighborhood civil war was heartbreaking to witness from the sidelines. Families who'd been close friends for years stopped speaking entirely. Children were forbidden from playing with kids whose parents had chosen the wrong side in the Daniel versus Margaret conflict. The annual summer block party was canceled for the first time in community history. HOA board meetings required police presence to maintain basic order as shouting matches erupted over every single agenda item. Margaret's supporters dwindled to a handful of die-hard allies who seemed more motivated by sunk cost fallacy than actual belief in her leadership abilities. The rest of the community finally understood what I'd known from the beginning. Margaret's war against me had never been about property values, community standards, or neighborhood safety. It was about power, control, and a narcissist's pathological inability to accept that she couldn't bully everyone into complete submission. My community outreach strategy was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. Host an informal barbecue for any neighbor willing to engage in reasonable conversation without lawyers present. 23 families attended, and I explained my legal position without once personally attacking Margaret or her character. I offered formal easement agreements at fair market rates, demonstrated my willingness to work cooperatively within the community structure, and proved definitively that I'd never been the source of neighborhood problems. The federal investigation escalated dramatically when the EPA referred Margaret's false reporting case to the FBI's white-collar crime division. Filing knowingly false environmental complaints isn't merely a bureaucratic inconvenience, it's a federal felony punishable by up to $500,000 in fines and potential imprisonment. Her husband Frank, facing his own criminal charges for property vandalism, plea bargained faster than you could spell conjugal visit, providing federal prosecutors with detailed evidence of Margaret's systematic harassment campaign, including recorded phone conversations and written instructions for illegal activities. The mini twist that ended Margaret's reign of suburban terror. While researching HOA incorporation documents for our civil lawsuit, Patricia discovered that Margaret had never actually satisfied residency requirements to legally serve as president. The bylaws explicitly required 8 years of continuous residency before eligibility for executive office, but Margaret had lived in Meadowbrook Commons for only 6 years when elected. Her entire presidency was legally invalid from day one. Every vote she'd cast, every legal action she'd authorized, every assessment she'd imposed, every decision she'd made, all of it was legally void according to their own governing documents. Margaret's remaining supporters scattered like roaches when fluorescent lights suddenly illuminate a dark kitchen, abandoning the woman who'd led them into financial and legal disaster with the enthusiasm of lemmings approaching a cliff. The texture of sweet vindication felt smoother than my grandfather's worn leather wire strippers, more satisfying than justice served at precisely the right temperature. The town hall meeting that would terminate Margaret's reign of suburban terror was standing room only, packed with 250-plus residents who'd traveled from 5 counties to witness what the regional newspaper had dubbed the Meadowbrook Meltdown. Mayor Elizabeth Chen personally presided over the emergency session, recognizing that this neighborhood dispute had exploded into a municipal crisis requiring official government intervention and resolution. The buzz of animated conversations filled the community center auditorium like electrical current before a power surge. Camera shutters clicked constantly as reporters from 3 television stations, 2 newspapers, and a true crime podcast positioned themselves for optimal documentation angles. This transcended simple property line disputes. This was about accountability, democratic governance, and what happens when petty authoritarians finally face consequences for their actions. Margaret approached the podium first, and her opening statement was pure desperation disguised as righteous community leadership. Wearing a charcoal gray suit that couldn't conceal the stress weight loss or dark circles under her eyes, she gripped the microphone like a life preserver and launched into what could only be described as a greatest hits compilation of her delusions and paranoia. I stand before you tonight representing law-abiding families who simply want to protect their community investment, she began, her voice already showing stress fractures. Daniel Martinez threatens everything we've built here with his industrial operation that violates every standard of residential living. His refusal to comply with reasonable community regulations demonstrates complete disregard for property values and family safety. The audience murmured disapproval as Margaret recited grievances that had been thoroughly debunked months earlier. Several residents shouted factual corrections when she claimed I was under federal criminal investigation, without mentioning it resulted from her own false EPA report. Her voice became increasingly shrill as she realized even her own neighbors weren't buying her performance anymore. When I approached the podium, the auditorium quieted like a church during prayer. I carried a leather portfolio containing 75 years of family documentation, and the large screen behind me displayed my grandfather's original 1948 deed in crisp, undeniable detail. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice calm and steady as bedrock. "What you're seeing is the deed to land my grandfather purchased when this entire area was wheat fields. This document predates every house in Meadowbrook Commons by 57 years. I methodically presented surveyor maps showing precisely which properties encroached on my family's land. The HOA clubhouse, the community pool complex, the main entrance roads, 14 residential homes, all constructed on property my family had owned since the Truman administration. I explained the water rights situation in simple terms any homeowner could understand. I own the artesian well that supplies your irrigation systems and decorative pond. I've been paying property taxes on land you've been using without legal permission for 6 years. Margaret attempted interrupting with increasingly desperate objections, but Mayor Chen maintained parliamentary order with professional precision. The evidence was overwhelming, documented, and impossible to dispute or dismiss. Patricia's presentation of the harassment timeline was absolutely devastating to Margaret's credibility. Security footage of Frank vandalizing my property played on the large screen like evidence in a criminal trial. Phone records documenting Margaret's systematic campaign against my business clients were displayed like a prosecutor's closing argument. Police reports, EPA investigation findings, and financial records of squandered HOA funds painted a picture of authority abuse that shocked even Margaret's remaining supporters into stunned silence. The mic drop moment arrived when I revealed my final card. "I could legally shut off your neighborhood's water supply tomorrow morning," I said, allowing that reality to sink in while Margaret visibly paled. "I could force every encroaching homeowner to relocate their houses at costs reaching $400,000 per family. I could demand 6 years of back rent for unauthorized land usage." The auditorium fell dead silent. You could hear people's shocked breathing and racing heartbeats. "But I'm not going to pursue any of those options," I continued, "because I'm not interested in destroying this community. I'm offering reasonable easement agreements at fair market rates, formal water rights licensing, and a collaborative path forward that protects everyone's investments while respecting my family's legal property rights." The applause was thunderous and sustained. Even some of Margaret's former allies were clapping enthusiastically. Margaret's public meltdown was spectacular, immediate, and completely unhinged. She rushed back to the microphone, voice cracking as she accused me of extortion, the mayor of corruption, and half the city council of conspiracy. Her makeup streaked from stress perspiration as she screamed increasingly incoherent accusations about cover-ups and good old boy networks protecting me because they wanted to destroy residential property values and allow commercial operations to contaminate family neighborhoods. "This is obviously a setup," she shrieked, spittle flying from her lips. "The entire system is rigged against honest homeowners who just want to protect their children from industrial hazards." Security personnel had to physically escort her from the building when she refused to relinquish the microphone and continued disrupting official proceedings. The image of Margaret being led away while still screaming about conspiracies, with her remaining supporters looking away in complete embarrassment, became front-page material for the next morning's newspaper. Mayor Chen announced immediate municipal mediation services for property dispute resolution. Police Chief Rodriguez confirmed that multiple criminal charges were pending against both Margaret and Frank. The county prosecutor explained potential federal prosecution for filing false environmental reports. The 3 remaining HOA board members publicly apologized to both me and the community for their catastrophic leadership failures and pledged complete cooperation with legal resolution processes. As Margaret attempted to leave quietly through a side exit, she was confronted by an angry crowd of neighbors demanding refunds of the legal fees she'd wasted on personal vendettas. Homeowners who'd lost insurance coverage because of her manufactured crisis shouted questions she couldn't answer coherently. Local news cameras captured her stammering non-responses and desperate attempts to shift blame to everyone except herself, the perfect ending to her reign of suburban tyranny. The community reckoning was immediate, decisive, and therapeutic. Emergency HOA elections were scheduled within 30 days. Margaret's remaining supporters publicly withdrew their endorsements and distanced themselves from her toxic leadership. New board candidates emerged promising fiscal responsibility, transparent governance, and respectful community relations based on cooperation rather than confrontation. That evening, as fresh air carried the scent of hope through Meadowbrook Commons for the first time in months, neighbors who hadn't spoken in over a year began tentative conversations about healing and moving forward. Children cautiously resumed playing together across property lines that had become battle lines. The civil war that Margaret had manufactured was finally ending, and everyone could sense the community's collective sigh of relief. Margaret Thornfield's reign of terror was officially over, and absolutely everyone knew it. The legal settlement negotiations consumed 8 weeks of careful diplomacy, but the outcome exceeded everything I'd hoped to achieve. Patricia worked with the newly elected HOA board, decent people who actually wanted to solve problems rather than create them, to establish formal easement agreements for all affected properties. Fair market compensation for land usage and water rights totaled $95,000, paid by the HOA through a special assessment that homeowners gladly approved once they understood the alternative involved potential lawsuits reaching into the millions of dollars. Every boundary dispute was officially surveyed and recorded with the county registrar. Property owners received clear title insurance that satisfied their mortgage companies. Real estate restrictions were lifted and property values stabilized once legal uncertainty disappeared completely. The community that Margaret had claimed to be protecting was finally protected from her destructive leadership. Margaret's personal downfall was swift, comprehensive, and poetic. She was convicted of filing false federal environmental reports and sentenced to 8 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and $25,000 in federal fines. Her husband Frank, who plea bargained in his vandalism case, publicly divorced her within 3 months, citing emotional abuse and systematic manipulation in court documents that became public record. Margaret's career in any field requiring professional integrity was permanently finished. Nobody hires someone with documented fraud convictions and federal criminal records. Within 4 months, Margaret had moved away from Meadowbrook Commons, selling her house at a $55,000 loss to escape the daily reminder of her spectacular failure and community rejection. Her elaborate garden pergola, symbol of her suburban superiority complex, was left behind for new owners who immediately had it demolished and replaced with practical storage space. The community healing process was remarkable and inspiring to witness firsthand. The newly elected HOA board, chosen through 89% voter participation, the highest in community history, completely revised bylaws to prevent future authority abuse. They implemented financial transparency requirements, term limits for all officers, mandatory community approval for any legal expenditures exceeding $3,000, and formal conflict resolution procedures that prioritized mediation over litigation. I was invited to serve as community relations advisor, helping establish protocols for resolving disputes before they exploded into neighborhood warfare. Our first collaborative initiative was reviving the annual summer barbecue tradition, held in my backyard with Miguel helping serve burgers and hot dogs to 75-plus neighbors. Watching children play on the same property where Margaret had attempted to destroy my livelihood felt like the sweetest possible victory. The sound of laughter returning to our house for the first time since my father's death was healing I didn't know I needed. Miguel, now 15 and thinking about college applications, told me he was proud of how I'd handled the entire situation. "Dad, you could have financially destroyed half the neighborhood, but you chose to help fix it instead. Great-Grandpa Roberto would be really proud of you." Standing in his workshop, surrounded by tools that had built 3 generations of honest electrical work, I finally felt like I'd honored his memory properly and maintained our family's integrity through the worst possible circumstances. My electrical contracting business actually expanded because of the positive publicity and community support. Homeowners across 3 counties started calling for property rights consultations, boundary surveys, and HOA compliance reviews. I became an accidental advocate for property rights education, speaking at real estate conferences and legal seminars about preventing HOA overreach and protecting individual property owners from bureaucratic abuse. The Property Rights Defense Fund I established has already helped 18 families fight similar HOA abuse cases, partnering with legal aid societies to provide free consultations, educational workshops, and emergency legal assistance. Our annual Know Your Property Rights seminar draws 300-plus attendees who learn about boundary laws, water rights, easement agreements, and HOA limitations before problems develop into community crises. Sometimes individual victories create lasting institutional change that protects future families from the Margaret Thornfields of the world. The practical lessons for anyone facing similar situations are straightforward but powerful. Always verify property boundaries before purchasing any home. Research HOA bylaws and financial health thoroughly. Document every harassment incident with detailed records and photographic evidence. Investigate your deed for valuable water rights or mineral rights. And remember that patience and legal knowledge often defeat intimidation more effectively than anger or retaliation. This experience demonstrates why standing up to petty authoritarians matters for entire communities. Strategic legal action can defeat systematic intimidation when you remain patient and methodical. Community healing becomes possible after even the most bitter conflicts when reasonable people choose cooperation over conquest. My measured professional response throughout the crisis proved more effective than emotional retaliation, demonstrating that principled persistence trumps power politics and personal vendettas every single time. On quiet evenings, I visit my father's grave and tell him about our victory over suburban tyranny. His Old Spice aftershave mixed with the scent of evening hope reminds me that some battles are worth fighting, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Grandfather Roberto's wire strippers now occupy a place of honor in the workshop, sharp and ready for the next generation of honest electrical work. 3 generations of family wisdom preserved this land through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and 1 suburban dictator. The Martinez legacy continues stronger than ever before. Drop a comment below telling us about your worst HOA nightmare or property dispute. We read every single response and might feature your story in future episodes. These David versus Goliath battles happen everywhere, and your experience could help other families fight back against bureaucratic abuse and neighborhood bullying. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because we've got more authority versus citizen stories coming that will absolutely make your day. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happened when a school board tried to silence a military veteran mother who discovered they were embezzling lunch money from special needs children's nutrition programs. Thanks for joining us here at HOA Stories. If you enjoyed today's showdown and seeing Margaret get her comeuppance, smash that like button, sound off in the comments about your own experiences, and subscribe to catch next week's drama-filled episode. You definitely don't want to miss it.